Welcome to the Book of Urm, Tales of Piecora, the Haunted Fortress. Chapter 5, Seat of Power. Seat of Power. Ravsesi sat with her son in the back of a large cart loaded with pumpkins and sacks of grains, apples, and other various staples locally grown in the realm of Dermida, one of the 5 realms that divide the lands of Canonia. The cart trundled along the hardened winter mud of the East Mare, within a crowded cavalcade of travellers consisting of merchants, families, guardsmen, couriers, mercenaries, entertainers and artisans, all making their way to Alagost for the Canonian Games. She wore a warm, woolen, light grey hood, covering her head and neck, lined with fox fur, and a linen veil that covered her hair and horns. A thick scarf, dyed in dark crimson, wrapped around her head, shoulders and face to protect her skin and eyes from the bright sun and biting cold air. A heavy fox fur-lined mantle, also light grey, covered her white tunic and fastened at the neck with iron clasp, shaped and painted like the fallen leaves of Dari Londoth, the old forest that surrounded Knightsport, which they travelled through now along the East Mare. Beneath the mantle, over the tunic, she wore a long-sleeved wool gown the colour of violet shale, cinched at the waist with a thin leather light brown belt. Woolen gloves the same crimson colour as her scarf protected her hands. Wool-lined leather boots covered her calves, keeping her feet warm. Her legs were wrapped in thick woolen stockings, dyed in the colour of charcoal. A simple knife was sheathed at her waist, tied to her belt. A leather purse was clasped to the belt on the other side of her waist. A small light leather shoulder bag was slung across her chest, and a new duffel bag sat behind her and against the pumpkins, filled with all of her things, old and new. Ortor wore a heavy brown woolen cloak with a deep hood that covered most of his head and face. He also had a thick scarf, dyed in moss green, covering his face, head and shoulders. A brooch clasped the cloak at his shoulder with the same design as his mother's, the fallen leaves of Dari Londoth. His hands were covered in grey woolen mittens, and his feet were covered in sturdy leather boots. Over his white tunic and beneath his hooded cloak, he wore a woolen waistcoat the colour of burnt cinnamon, and his legs were wrapped in dark brown stockings. A wide leather belt wrapped around the waistcoat, and a small knife was sheathed at his side. He also had a new duffel bag filled with his belongings, and it, too, sat behind him against the pumpkins in the bouncing cart. Unlike when they first arrived in Knightsport, Ravsesi and Artor now looked like proper middle-class Canonian locals, just a well-presented mother and son. Cassandra was very pleased with the outfits she put them in, convinced that nobody should bother them now. Cassandra paid for it all either with coins or favours. Ravsesi couldn't believe or understand the wealth of kindness that exuded from the young innkeeper, the daughter of a priest of Hades. Ravsesi knew there was no way she could ever repay her, but Cassandra would hear no talk of compensation. She seemed to enjoy every moment of caring for Ravsesi and Ortor. "All I ask in return is for you and your son to visit from time to time when all of this is over. Consider this my investment in that eventuality," Cassandra said. Ravsesi leaned her head back and watched the near disparate branches of the forest slowly drift by overhead, letting the warm sun dapple across her face. She thought about the last 2 days in Knightsport, shopping in the market that surrounded the Callistico fountain in the middle of the town. All of the clothes were purchased in Mardium's garments, whose daughter, Esthemar, travelled all over the country buying and trading clothes for the shop. She was in town this week, helping her mother tend the shop and the crowds. Esthemar explained where each piece of their new garb came from. The fur-lined cloaks were local, as were the brooches, but the clothes were Durin-Ladin, the boots Enigradan, and the gloves and scarves were from Alagost. The purse, bags and other supplies came from the travellers' store in the Knightsport market, owned by Hegus Athelios and his family for generations. Aulus Handhammer, the town's blacksmith, handcrafted the 2 knives. The huge monster of a man spoke with a strange guttural accent and claimed to be of the Irhusk tribe, far to the north and beyond the mountains of Erith August. They visited the Dragon's Eye, a gem and jewellery shop run by young Melis Ombia with her frizzy hair and intense gaze, and ogled at the beautiful earrings, necklaces and trinkets in her shop. They visited the temple of the town, featuring the twin Canonian patron gods of Alagost, Zeus and Hera, where the head priest Sebastos Fortier gave them blessings for the road. Then they found themselves in front of Gulthelm's Arts, that trades and collects in art objects like paintings, sculptures, mosaics and textiles. Ravzeza knew by the name and the look of the man inside that he was Muthan, so they didn't go inside. However, several pieces within caught Ravzeza's eye, and she thought she was able to recognise their works, remembering the hands that created them, a celebrated artist back home. Back home? No, we shall not call it that any more, thought Ravzeza. My home lies ahead, wherever that may be. Not behind me. They dined outside on the docks, inside the common room, and out front facing the fountain, morning, midday and evening. They ate fish, pork and lamb, and eggs and poultry, and a variety of other birds. They had soup and biscuits, tarts and breads, creams and pastries. They snacked on apples and carrots, and candied beets that were a local favourite. They slept and woke when they desired, and Ravzeza luxuriated in every moment that she stayed in Knightsport, even with the dense crowds of people that filled the town day and night, while on their way to Alagost, the seat of power over the rest of the country. All the while, Piecora stayed close to Ravzeza and her son. She never seemed comfortable in Knightsport, always avoiding the crowds by positioning herself within the dense forest, surrounding the central market, houses and side streets, while keeping her eyes on her charges. People seemed both afraid and enamoured by her, pointing and asking her questions, and Piecora was as cordial as a Xianjian could be expected to be. And whenever Ravzeza felt herself relax just a little, even to contemplate the possibility of a life here, her eyes would find Piecora somewhere in the shade of the forest, silhouetted by those antlers of stag. And Piecora would look back at her with that stern Xianjian countenance that reminded Ravzeza that this adventure was far from over, and not to let herself become idle. If she didn't feel Piecora's eyes on her, it was her pet raptor either swooping low across the sky or perched somewhere above in the trees, watching everything below. Rultin busied himself during their stay in Knightsport by meeting with various factions within the town, making clandestine deals and arrangements with local merchants and labour people like dockworkers, fishers, cobblers, ferriers, smiths, craftsfolk, and lumberfolk. More significantly, he coordinated the journey from Knightsport to Alagost with the local thieves' guild called the Knives, which operated from a wooden fortress deep within Dari Londoth, thought to be led by a tall, enigmatic Shava elf named Julian Grey-Eye and his spouse, Evelian. Eventually, when Rultin had everything ready, he announced when they would leave, and in which manner Ravzeza and Artor would hop onto the large pumpkin cart, as it left the town early that morning with several other merchants travelling through town together. They would be surrounded by a loose crowd of artisans, bakers, seamsters, entertainers and spectators who were also heading to Alagost to sell their wares and services during the games. Finally, many knives in disguise would be inserted within the large cavalcade, and by then the group would have grown to such a size that it would draw the attention of both Alagostan guardsmen and Knightsport militia. Each would allow a few of their members to go with the large group, forming a light perimeter around the travellers along the road. Sitting here in the back of the cart with her son beside her, as the branches above drifted by, and feeling the sun's warmth on her face, surrounded by so many festive people, unified in singing and laughing, and in general enjoying the road to Alagost together for the upcoming games, it was the first time she allowed herself to fully deflate and float within the nebulous limbo that existed between sleep and wakefulness. Occasionally, she would peek through her half-closed eyes and see Piecora on her large Xianjian horse like some goddess out of Canonian mythology, riding stoically behind the cart, while children chased each other around her horse with ribbons, banners and kites, no taller than the horse's knees, and be reminded of the ever-present danger they were in, and the constant vigilance she and her son were under, while marked with Siligan ink on their faces as the Xianjian guide's charge of protection. Ravsese roused to wakefulness when she felt a slight shudder in the trundling cart, and opening her eyes, she saw Rultin had just hopped up and was leaning on a burlap sack of apples. The afternoon the sun was low in the sky to the west, hovering over the great Angriluin River, where there was only dark blue water, and whose western edge was lost in the distance, so wide the river was. To the east, the large, dense forest of Dari Londoth, with its overhanging boughs of maples and oaks, loomed over the East Mare Road. The noise of the festive crowd had died down a bit, as the children of the crowd had grown tired from their activity earlier in the day. Ravsese could only hear idle conversation here and there over the creaking wheels of the cart, only making out a few words at a time. "How ye be faring?" asked Rultin gaily. He plucked a sour green apple from the sack and heartily bit into it. Ravsese smiled weakly as she stretched her arms and legs. "Oh, a bit stiff. A good walkabout would help my limbs wake up." She then lazily pointed across the river to her right, into the orange winter sun. "The setting sun is beautiful tonight. Look how it hangs above the water. What's on the other side of the river in these parts?" Rultin twisted to look out across the river and said, By me measure, if we be in where we be, 'tis the forest of Dari Kileus that covers the West Mare o'er there, and maybe the town of Fryn somewhere on the road, just a small fishing town on the far bank of the river. And my guess be the pack of wolves be holding some poor traveller up for their toll money. Just a gang of petty thieves, wouldn't even call them ruffians or brigands, just kids living in the woods trying to get by. Forest be older o'er there, and larger than this one here, Dari Londoth. Wilder parts o'er there, more dangerous to travel the road than o'er here, so close the Alagost we are." "When should we be arriving?" asked Ravsese. "If we break for camp tonight, then we should get there by night tomorrow or next morning, depending on how quickly we can all get our act together." "What are you expecting when we get there?" Rultin shook his head. "More people than you or I have seen in our lives. Enough to send our Xianjian guide into trauma, most likely. We'll need to keep an eye on her." "Watch her as she watches us, then," Ravsese said. "Indeed, I really don't know what to expect. I got us rooms at the Bishop's Lament." "The Bishop's Lament? What a strange name for an inn," Ravsese said. "Not me first choice, that's for certain," Rultin said. "Decadent, indulgent, only for the wealthy and depraved. I think the knives are putting us in there as a joke, to be honest." "The knives have that much pull in Alagost? I thought they lived in the forest near Knightsport," Ravsese said. "Julian Greyeye, he has spies all over these parts, including inside Alagost. The Bishop's Lament? Of course he'd put us there just for a laugh. Gods, what a travesty. It'll be interesting, I promise you that. Keep your son close to you." The way Rultin described this place reminded Ravsese of some of the establishments that existed just outside the walls of Eindungzirk, the Unskavian district of Norschlan, where the Unskavia lived. Her people were free and expressive within the confines of the district's walls, and they lived by their own laws and codes. Culturally, artistically, and in all things related to the indulgence of the senses, the Unskavian district influenced the entire country of Muth that surrounded it. The humans of Muth were hopelessly and sinfully infatuated by Unskavian styles, craving every new thing that was discovered within Eindungzirk. All popular trends of fashion and food, art and design, music and mirth, theatre and comedy, originated from the Unskavia in Eindungzirk. Many businesses that were near the walls surrounding Eindungzirk, including restaurants, inns, bodegas, brothels and theatres, were especially influenced by the Unskavian Devilkin people just on the other side of the wall. But since these human-owned businesses were on the outside of the wall and were frequented by Muthan humans, these pantomimes of Unscavian culture were often overdone, contrived, misleading, and sometimes even ludicrous, serving as exaggerated mockeries that indulged in dark, fantastical, and goofy human-made representations of the Unscavian culture they oppressed. She had only heard of such places, and her people generally considered them to be the worst culmination of insidiousness that they've had to endure while under Muthan rule since the beginning, celebrating Unscavian stereotypes as outlandishly and cruelly as possible. She wasn't certain if Rultin's description of the bishop's lament was anything like these awful places just outside the walls of Indungzirk, but it seemed to at least strike a similar chord. That night, the caravan came to rest on the road as the waning white moon, Alba Meluna, as it is named in Canonia, slowly drifted from the encroaching red moon, Rubri Meluna, who was fuller and brighter as it rose steadily in the sky, casting the terrain in soft light pink hues and deep shadows. Ravzeshi marked the astronomical change from the prevalence of the white moon over the last week, thinking of the astrological implications it must have on the more superstitious people of these lands. The white moon was largely regarded as a portent of goodness and productivity, whereas the red moon was a harbinger of uncertainty and mischief. There was also the green moon that rose into the sky less often than the other two. Viridra Luna was its Canonian name, and it was generally known to bring evil and danger. Thankfully, the green moon was nowhere to be seen tonight, and hadn't been for quite some time. Muthans generally disregarded the various mythologies that surrounded the 3 moons of Urm, that randomly came and went in the sky, as if governed by their own agency, although they certainly did ascribe to their behavioural effects on people and geological effects on tides, crops, and many other aspects of the world. They recognised the 3 moons' power and influence over world, especially when more than one was present in the sky, but they didn't believe it held a spiritual or mythical power. Theirs was a logical view of the moons and their effects, and these beliefs aligned with Muth's overall system of religion, reverence of the natural elements of the world as their own powers and influences, deserving of praise, wonder, and obedience. Unscavians, however, did believe in such superstitions of the 3 moons. But she grew up and lived her whole life among the Muthans until she was sent to the surrogate family in Eindungzirk and had Artor. She remembered clearly that night when the family rejoiced at the birth of her son, noting that Vaishlerimund, the Muthan name for the white moon, was full and rising toward its apex, shining down through the window behind her as she held her son for the first time. The large family danced around her, lit incense, smoked powerful, mind-altering herbs, and burned effigies in Ortor's name, claiming he was blessed. The memory filled her with the same joy that she felt that night, even though she didn't believe in what they believed despite her Unscavian race and heritage. These thoughts often left her drifting between the 2 worlds that she identified with, both Muthan and Unscavian, leaning this way and that depending on the circumstances. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky this night, and it was frightfully cold. A large bonfire was made on the grassy bank of the Angriluin River, where everyone gathered around, bundled in their cloaks and blankets to sing various Canonian carols and lullabies. Together she and Ortor sat near the fire in their own cloaks and blankets, nestled against other warm bodies around them, while the guard stood and watched the perimeter around the road. She laid back and watched the final remnants of the white moon disappear behind the dark branches of Dari Londoth, and felt Autor lay his head on her stomach. Together they fell asleep by the fire beneath rising Rotaramund, the red moon in the Muthan tongue, or Rakdaganomdra in the language of the 9 hells, or Ilethixuadoch as it is properly called by those who come from the cosmic realm, like Ikthefaloxu. The next morning, Ravsese awoke after sleeping uneasily during the night. Anxious dreams of closed-in spaces and garish faces of exaggerated Unscavian features closed in on her as she raced to catch up with Autor, who she could only catch glimpses of through dark, endless crowds. As the nightmares quickly receded from her mind, she noticed Autor wasn't with her. Sitting up and looking around while trying not to panic, she found him helping Roltin loading the cart with their things, and she sighed with relief. It was early morning, and a light mist lifted gently from the nearby river. The vegetation along the Angriluin's banks was frozen, covered in fine ice crystals. Ravsesi stood up, arched her back and stretched her stiff limbs, gathered the blankets around her, and made her way to Roltin and her son. "Strong lad, when he puts his mind to it," Roltin said, as he hefted her things into Autor's waiting arms in the back of the cart. Something zipped low overhead, and Ravsese looked up to see Hero swooping into the mists above the river, banking hard to the right and upwards into the morning sky. Piecora had emerged from the forest clutching rabbits and squirrels over her shoulder and proceeded to clasp them to the side of her gigantic Xianjian horse. "When do you suppose she takes these marks off our face, Mum?" asked Arthur. He had become more talkative ever since he first spoke to Cassandra, innkeeper of the River Watch in Knightsport. "When they wear off, I guess," Ravsesi said as she climbed onto the cart. "Or our next hot bath. I assume the Bishop's Lament has those, Roltin." "Oh, the Bishop surely do, m'lady," said Roltin as he hopped into the cart. A sudden swelling sound, like an oncoming avalanche, jolted Ravsese awake in the pumpkin cart. She must have dozed off to sleep sometime during the afternoon. The sky was a late autumnal purple dusk, and the sun, a weak red ember, low in the western sky behind drifting ribbons of heavy, dark clouds. An icy wind had picked up and blew across the cart. All around her was the massive sound of people collected in numbers she had never heard before. Arthur stood next to her, on his toes, looking forward with wide eyes and holding his hood close over his face with his hand. Roltin remained asleep near the back of the cart, one leg dangling from the ledge. She hopped up to look around just as another concussive wave of sound hit her on all sides. It was the sound of thousands of people suddenly rising in reaction to something she couldn't see or comprehend. The forest had thinned down considerably here, and for as far as her eyes could see into the forest were camps of people, tents, cook fires, horses, cattle, children and adults. The crowds grew denser as they converged toward the road. The pace of their pumpkin cart and their surrounding caravan had slowed considerably, surrounded on all sides by a solid mass of people. The view forward, however, took her breath away. Filling the sky before her, lit in red horizontally by the dying sun in the west and shadowed in darkness in the east, were the soaring wall and towers of Cannoneer's seat of power, the throne city of Alagos that ruled over the 6 other major cities, the 5 realms, and all of Cannoneer, even Coast Haven to some extent. Ravsese had never dreamed of such an experience as this. She had seen her share of Norshlan, the capital of Muth, but it was small compared to the city before her. Alagost's wall began at the banks of the Angriluin, where ships large and small, too many to count, were anchored in the river along the city's docks. From there, the wall went on into the east, disappearing from view adjacent to the thinning forest of Dari Londoth. It was hard to tell, but the wall seemed to curve around the city, but at such a great distance and scale, it seemed flat where it was nearest to her. Within the giant stone wall were glimpses of towers, domes, statues, pinnacles, steeples, banners, and roofs of buildings that reached high into the dusky sky. People walked along the top of the wall, just tiny specks like insects from her current vantage. Behind the cart, perhaps by 100 meters like a floating island within the surrounding mob, sat Piecora on her Xianjian horse, walking slowly and resolutely forward, head bowed into shadow. This must be killing her, Ravsese thought to herself. And to her, it was all indeed extremely overwhelming, but she also couldn't deny a certain exhilaration within her, like being on the very precipice of a waterfall and knowing without any doubt which way the current flowed. She was utterly in the hands of the fates now, and it was both terrifying and exciting. "Can you believe it, Otter?" she shouted above the crowd noise. Tears filled her eyes from staring unblinking into the cold winds. "This is but only one city in these lands. Did you know this many people even lived?" "They call it the kingdom of mankind, Mama," Otter said as he reached up and pulled Ravses's hood back over her head. She had completely forgotten about her hood or the need to hide their physical features, but his quiet rebuke and gesture reminded her of the danger they were in. Looking closer over the endless crowd, she realized they were surrounded by humankind, and if she and her son were seen as they were, the consequences could be swift and dire. Slowly her cart was drawn into the city by the crowds, like foam into a gutter. She stared in awe as they passed through the fortified tunnel entrance with massive portcullises on either side. The sound of the crowd roared into a deafening wash across the senses, and both Ravses and Otor covered their ears as they emerged from the tunnel entrance into the city's congested courtyard. The density of the crowd here was a solid volume packing the spacious courtyard, with guards working tirelessly to keep the people moving forward, funneling them into the countless streets, squares, bridges, tunnels and thoroughfares on the other side of the courtyard. The pumpkin cart continued moving along according to the surrounding current of people, until finally they passed into a wide avenue that rose in elevation as it led deeper into the city. Tall lampposts were lit for the evening on either side. Large banners flew overhead, signalling the travelling Canonian games and the many fighters that participated. Slowly they travelled up the street as the crowd around them thinned out, until Ravses noticed Piecora striding beside them on her horse. She looked exhausted, slouched in her Sienjan saddle with a light carpet of snow on her and her horse, while staring ahead lifelessly. Ravsese wanted to reach out to her and say something comforting, but she couldn't find the words. Sometime during the middle of the night, with light snow flurries drifting from the sky, the pumpkin cart finally came to a stop on the outskirts of a public garden. Ravses, Otor and Rultin hopped out and stood on solid ground again after what felt like years of being in the cart. Ravses could hardly believe that only 3 days ago they were in Coast Haven. Everything about Canoniah seemed to be on a completely different level than Muth, and she wondered if Muth ever realised its own inferiority when compared to its long-established ally here. She wondered if Muth had ever been challenged by Canonia. Her own studies of Muth's history indicated there had never been war between the two countries, not like Muth and Heliclese or Muth and Brenz, or Muth and Strunder, or Dorin or Zakra, which existed further south on the same peninsula as Muth. It seemed like Muth fought with everyone at one time or another except Canonia. "Lucky for them," she said quietly to herself as she stared back down the road they came from, lit by perfectly spaced lamp posts, as it descended down into the crowd still arriving in Alagost. "Lucky for who, milady?" asked Rultin, as he came back from handing coins to a few of the people they travelled with, including the pumpkin cart driver. "Has there ever been war between Muth and Canoniah?" asked Ravses. "None that I'm aware of," Rultin said. "'Tis all political 'tween the two, though. Sometimes things get strained, I wager, but ne'er came to blows, thank gods. Can ye imagine the naval battles o'er the salt sea? 'Twould send us both back 100 years at least. Not good for business for nobody." He then flagged a passing rickshaw, and the three of them piled into the carriage, while Piecora followed on her horse. Along the way, Ravses and Rultin chatted quietly about Canonian history and politics. "How does Alagost rule over this country?" asked Ravses. "Alagost be the seat of power in Canonia," said Rultin. "King Dumacus and Queen Ambrian rule from here. Rich lines 'tween 'em both, but they do not rule alone. They push their powers down and spread 'em out. The ruling seven is a body of nobles representing each major city of Canoniah. Their positions be named after the 7 stones which also represent the cities. They live within Alagost and counsel the king and queen on domestic affairs every single day. They also work closely with Alagostan civil groups, as well as managing requests from the 5 ambassadors when they visit from their respective cities. The ruling 7 also forms the Games Council, who organises and schedules the Canonian Games each year. The 5 ambassadors travel back and forth between their cities and Alagost, bringing their business before the seat of power, and then returning to their home cities with whatever decree they received from the throne. Cassandra's father, Tondul Blalos, serves the Ambassador Gervenwerth of Thessal Dargad, one of the 7 cities. Then ye have the likes of the Sage Guild and the offices of the chroniclers and so on as the powers get pushed further down and spread out through committees and subcommittees that keep the whole country rolling along. Alagost is like a giant bureaucratic machine, the most populated city in the country. More people work here than live here. This is where everything happens. Without Alagost, the whole country would fly into pieces in 6 different directions. And do ye know what else it is? What is that? Responded Ravsis. 'Tis the last stop o' the games. That's why ye see everyone and their grandmums come into the city. The whole country flocks to Alagost to see who wins the games after they've been to every other of the 6 major cities. That's why it's perfect timing for us to come here, for the right and maybe the wrong reasons. What do you mean? Asked Ravsesa. Nothing compares to the games if you want to get lost and not found, like how the little fish all group up into a ball when a shark approaches, and yet 'tis also a bit o' irony considering who your enemies are. If it's true, what dear Alice told ye about your Chancellor selling your son and ye to Hector my Ganter to raise Ortor to fight in the games, then hazard a guess as to where that loathsome lord just might be right now, right here in Alagost at the end of the games tour across the country. Ravsisi felt her blood run cold. He's here. He must be here. Oh no, we can't be here, she said fearfully. And we be put up in a bishop's lament, where all the nobles and wealthy slime go to mix and mingle. Oh, just our luck in it. We can't go there, said Ravsesa, feeling panic rising within her. This feels like a trap. Why can't we go somewhere else? I'd sooner sleep on the street. Nah, calm yourself, lass, said Rultin, waving his hand. We be going to the bishop and Cassandra got you both all dressed up for it. Can't let that go to waste. Chances o' meeting old Ganter anywhere while we're here be slim to none, even if you be sitting at the same table as he. You'll see what I mean when you get there. Just keep your head low but eyes up, and keep that tail and those horns hidden. Sides, there's another noble we aim to meet, remember? We need to find Eindon Vandus, get him to sponsor your trip into the wildlands, get you all supplied and suited up, and ye can be off with the Sienjan out of this city and far, far away from these lands. Gotta punch through the gauntlet first. Gotta be a lil patient. Let me do all the talking. Brought me along for a reason, right? Ravsesi settled back into the carriage's padded leather seat and closed her eyes, unable to see anything in her immediate future. It felt like standing in a fog so dense she couldn't see beyond her outstretched hand. She felt Artor close his little hand around hers, and she squeezed back. Finally, after perhaps half the night had passed, the carriage let them off within a wealthy area of the city adjacent to Alagost's Colosseum of the Canonian Games, called Judius Ubideorum, or Justice Beneath the Gods, as it is called in the Low Canonian common speech. Ravsesa stared up at the surrounding wall of the Colosseum towering above, while listening to the wheels of the carriage roll down the street and fade into the night. Piecora slowly caught up with them on her horse. Ravses felt a gentle hand on her arm, and turning she saw Rultin next to her, gesturing to follow him down the street nearest to them. The light snow gently fell from the cloud-streaked sky, lit by the full red moon above. The air was still, but with a freezing breeze that whistled past the ears. The area was well lit by brightly burning lamps on every corner, and spaced just enough on each street to disallow the shadow of the night from encroaching into the streets. Many people were out and about regardless of the late hour or the cold night air. Ravziz noticed people like themselves who were from out of town, wandering around and trying to find their destinations. She watched someone dressed in foppish, well-appointed attire, without any coat, stagger drunkenly from lamppost to lamppost. She spied two people kissing by the side of a building in the darkness, just outside the nearest lamp's light, to keep their dalliance from public view. Occasionally she heard a squeal, as if someone was poked unexpectedly, and sporadic bursts of laughter echoed off nearby walls and alleyways. A distant dog barked, and a cat yowled from a nearby doorway, hidden in shadow. Distant string and flute music could be heard drifting through the streets and over the rooftops from an all-night establishment. All the while came the heavy hooves of Piecora's horse clomping slowly behind them, with wet snowflakes building on her horse and heavy cloak. "Very different. The night is here than in Coast Haven," Ravzizi said while they hurried along the street. "Aye, it is, and certainly colder. Keep moving, not much further," said Rolton. They continued on through the eerie Alagostan frosty night, up the street until they arrived at the looming establishment called the Bishop's Lament. It was a large keep surrounded by tall stone walls and a gated entrance. Rolton spoke with the person inside the gatehouse, and then ushered the group through the wall and into the keep's courtyard. A groundskeeper and a stableman took Piecora's horse to the stables once she removed her gear. "It's a fortress," whispered Ravziz wondrously as she observed the surrounding gardens and the main building before them. It loomed over them with the cloud-streaked red moon behind its tallest tower. They shivered as they stood in its cold, dark shadow. "One of many," said Rolton. "Let's get inside where it's warm. Keep your wits about you. This place, it has its way with people. Draws 'em off guard, lulls 'em to sleep. Can make you drunk without taking a drink, or make you crazy when you think you're the only sane one. Lots of stories I heard. You can lose yourself in here, forget the time, disappear entirely. Stick together, don't walk alone, and don't feed the animals." Before Ravziz could ask what he meant by feeding animals, she heard Ortor suddenly say, "Can I carry something?" He held his hands up to Piecora while wearing his own duffel bag strapped across his chest. Piecora chuckled softly and handed him the brace of rabbits and squirrels she and Hierro caught earlier that morning, then tousled his hair with her hand. Ravzizi continued to marvel at Ortor incrementally breaching his shell with those he liked and trusted. She always wondered if something might be wrong with him, or if their life had left him with trauma that stifled an otherwise perfectly normal little boy. But when she saw him make little gestures like these, unprompted by anyone, especially her, she didn't care what the source of his difficulties were. She was just happy to see his bourgeoning personality emerge, little by little. Perhaps all it took was getting out of Muth. As they crossed the manicured courtyard and approached the main entrance to the keep, Ravziz heard muted music and laughter from the large, ominous fortress. In all of its windows, arrow slits and murder holes, she saw the warm glow of firelight. On the ramparts above, she saw several guards walking along the multi-level walls lit by bright torches. She stared up at them in wonder and disbelief that this place was merely an inn. It made her try to somehow quantify the amount of wealth accumulated here between the owners of the Bishop's Lament and the clientele who frequented the place. Then she wondered about how exclusive this place must be, and how many people from the working class might not even know of its existence. An armoured gatekeeper greeted them warmly and bowed while opening the large, heavy, reinforced double doors to the keep. Inside, a long, dark tunnel greeted them with warm air and the sounds of strange animals and creatures, mixed with jubilant music reverberating throughout the halls of the fortress. "Straight on through, my dear travellers," he yelled in a bardic crier's voice. "Up the stairs at the end, and your hostess will deliver whatever you desire, or take you to your rooms. We've been waiting for you, guests." On either side of the tunnel were many wooden doors that Ravziz assumed would be used for storage, as well as perhaps a wine cellar, a small smithy for making and repairing tools and utensils, maybe a washroom for clothing, and perhaps even a barracks to hold arms and armour. She had no idea if any of her assumptions were true, but she was guessing based on her own familiarity with the layouts of the house mansions and their servants back home in Muth. They went up the wide stone steps to another pair of wooden double doors, and before Rultin could reach them, they swung open to reveal a sight that none among their party could have been prepared for. A blast of hot air washed over them, along with the loud, concussive roar of a gigantic cat beast with orange and black stripes, held within an iron cage, hanging by chains from the rafters high overhead. The enormous room had multiple levels, paths, walkways and catwalks, numerous bars and separate areas of tables, and performance stages. Several other animals and creatures were also caged and hanging from the wooden, rough-hewn beams crisscrossing the ceiling, including a giant snake, a large bird with bright red and orange plumage, and a huge primate with long, auburn-red hair, who sat in its cage and studied the occupants below with a subtle semi-intelligence. One stage featured a group of musicians with drums, flutes, and stringed instruments. Another stage had a magician performing tricks with his audience. Still another stage held several acrobats rolling, diving, and flipping over and under each other. A bright pulse of hot flame drew Ravses's attention to her left, as a man breathing fire while riding a strange, single-wheeled device that she never in her entire life expected to see here, but one she remembered seeing years ago while living in Eindungzirk. A Brenzage invention called a unicycle. The performer was making his rounds throughout the entire common area, lighting the air on fire above the patrons' heads. There was even more to see than this first glimpse within her immediate perception, happening further back, through the crowds and beyond her view. But then a female deadpan voice spoke very near to her, bringing her attention back to her present. "Welcome to the Bishop's Lament," the apathetic voice said in a monotone voice. "A once great fortress with a storied history, built long before the great city of Alagost was formed around its indestructible walls. It is now an official heritage site maintained with pride by our Lord and Lady, King Dumachis, and Queen Ambrienne." Ravses blinked several times, and then looked down and to her right to find the source of the voice. A girl stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, probably in her early to mid-teens with straw hair cut in a bowl with bangs just above her eyes. Long strands of her hair, several of which were braided, hung like ribbons in front of her ears. She displayed the teenager body language of wanting to be anywhere else but here, while dutifully performing what was required of her, as this was her job. She wore a simple white linen shirt that hung to her knees, cinched at the waist by a thin leather belt. Leather tassel sandals covered her feet and wrapped up her calves. "May I provide you with a beverage or a meal, or would you like a tour of our great offerings? Or would you like to retire to your room so you can indulge in our premium—" "Room!" boomed Piecora flatly from the tunnel behind Ravses. The girl jumped as her soul briefly left her body, then she curtsied awkwardly like a child performing on stage at a talent show. "It shall be my desire then to take you to your room," the girl said. "Feel free to ask me any questions along the way. I'm at your service until dawn, and then my next shift at tomorrow midnight." Ravses turned back around after briefly looking at Piecora behind her, and was about to follow the girl, when something odd about Ortor caught her eye. Looking down at him, she saw that he was staring at the girl without blinking. But this was not his normal vacant stare. This was the stare of a boy experiencing a strange new longing within him for the very first time. Ravses stifled a laugh, then sighed, fixed his hood, and said, "Come on, son, and close your mouth. Let's not draw attention." The young hostess led them into the midst of the madness, where people laughed and slept and cavorted in all sorts of fantastical indulgences, reserved only for the wealthiest of Canonians. Ravses had seen her fair share of affluent depravity while she lived in House Veklischer, except that so much of it was derived and exaggerated from Muscavian culture. Seeing rich Muthan humans indulge in grotesque mockeries of Muscavian culture infuriated her, even as she was more familiar with theirs than her own. But then she lived in Eindungzirk, with her surrogate family and Hadortor, and she learned all about the truth of Unskavia, her history and heritage, and this enlightenment only made Muthan human behaviour all the more ridiculous and insulting to her. But here, these were Canonians through and through, and she realised while being led by this poor servant girl that, during the brief time she had been in Canonia, she was exposed to the entire class spectrum of Canonian society, from the poorest in Coast Haven to the richest here in the Bishop's Lament in Alagost. She felt like she sliced a vertical sample of the entire Canonian social strata and ate it all in one bite, and her mind was still passing through all of the complexities that existed here. There was a loud hiss to her right, and a low rumble and a splash, and cold water leapt up and covered her right side. Recoiling, she saw a giant crocodile chained within a large, tiled pool of water, who just tried to take a bite out of her. "Mind, Philip, your smell is new to him," drawled the young girl leading them. Rultin gently ushered Ravsais and Autor so that the two walked between himself and Piecora. A body flew right over them, and Ravsais saw a figure hanging by a single bar, attached by long wires to a wooden rafter in the ceiling. He clung to the swing's bar with only his bent right leg and left foot as he sprayed a sweet-smelling perfume over the patrons from his mouth. A loud, female laugh then caught her attention, like something that came down from the heavens. Searching for the source of the laugh, she saw a tall and shapely elf, stunningly beautiful, wearing a black bodice beneath an open, bright red silk gown that contoured the form of her figure. A dark, fox fur shawl hung behind her, beneath her bare shoulders and around her arms. She wore long, black, silk elbow gloves, and on her delicate feet were pointed, black slippers like the kind dancers wore in Muth. A thin, glittering necklace hung from her slender neck, and bracelets of the same make as the necklace hung on both her wrists. Several gem-encrusted earrings hung from her elegantly pointed ears, refracting the lamplight in bedazzling kaleidoscopic patterns across her neck. She had long, flowing jet-black hair, with deep auburn red ends that fell around her shoulders like an ink spill, and around her forehead she wore an ornate silver tiara set with small red rubies. Her light amber eyes were the colour of honey lit by sunlight, accentuated by black and violet eye makeup. Her full lips were painted in bright red, the same colour as her gown, and her face was covered in a soft white powder that glittered in the surrounding lamplight as she moved. She sat with her legs crossed demurely at the nearby bar with a middle-aged male human who was finely manicured and dressed in what Ravsais would call casual noble, a simple tunic and loose breeches with sandals that were understated and plain in design, but exquisite in quality. Not a single wrinkle or pleat could be found throughout his entire outfit. He stood facing the elf maiden, speaking and gesticulating, and his body language showed Ravsais as clearly and desperately vying for the elf maiden's affections, which the elf clearly enjoyed as she laughed through their conversation. But Ravsais could also tell in the elf's eyes that she had no interest in the man. In fact, her eyes seemed to roam over the room while giving him only one ear to listen with, as if its only purpose were to time her laughter effectively enough to convince the man that she was listening to him at all. But then the elf's eyes connected with Ravsais's, and they locked onto her. Ravsais shivered and quickly pulled her hood up, covering her face while looking down, and deciding to only focus on their hostess from here on out until they finally made it to their room. They reached an open circular staircase in a corner of the large chamber made with iron rungs and wooden planks, and up they went through the ceiling and several more floors above, each one containing a hall with rooms on either side. They finally entered the third hall, where at the end a large arched window was set in the natural stone wall, reminding Ravsais of the Riverwatch in a way, except they were much higher here, and you could probably fit several Riverwatches within the spacious common room below. The girl unlocked the heavy reinforced door with a large key, and it opened without a sound. Inside, Ravses saw a large estate room with several open windows like the one at the end of the hall. The floor was richly carpeted with furs and rugs, and a large porcelain tub with 2 statues, one male and one female on either end, sat against the far wall beneath one of the windows. Ravses guessed that at least 2 people could fit inside the tub. 2 spigots were attached to the wall over the tub. A woven basket of soaps and oils sat on a side table beside the tub. The walls were lined with paintings and embroideries with gigantic gold-gilt frames and ornate, richly coloured tapestries with large gold and silver tassels. Marble statuary of what Ravses assumed were Canonian gods stood in each corner of the room. Above the door hung a large circular shield with the Alagostan star device with 2 long claymore swords crossed behind it. 3 beds stood against the back wall next to each other, each one beneath a window. They were lifted on wooden frames with clawed feet for legs, animal furs for blankets, and several down pillows for each. A large wooden writing desk sat against another wall, and a circular wooden dining table with 6 chairs sat in the middle of the room. Several luxurious chairs, padded and upholstered with leather and velvet, were also in the room. The girl went about the room lighting candles and lamps until the room was well lit. Despite the warmth within the room, a viciously cold breeze filtered in from the windows. "Would my lords and ladies like the windows open or shuttered?" Rultin said shuttered, but Piecora said open, both at the same time. Then they both looked at Ravses to break the stalemate. "Leave one open, please," said Ravses. "Piecora, that can be your bed." Piecora then crossed the room and heaved her gear onto the bed beneath the one open window. She briefly looked down through the open window, whistled, and remarked quietly, "That's a long way down." She then reached out and drew the shutters closed herself. Turning to the group, she said, "Nothing's getting at us from outside, that's for sure, unless it can fly." "The left one is for hot water, the right is for cold," said the girl, gesturing toward the tub. "Use as much as you like, whenever you like. We have plenty to serve. Will you need food brought to you? Or will you partake in our entertainment below? Do you have any requests or needs?" Rultin spoke quickly. Nothing. Thank you, my dear girl, that will be all. You can run along now. Here's some coin for your trouble." The girl then hurried to the door, opened it, turned and said, "If you need anything at all, you can summon me as your personal host until dawn, or when my shift starts again midnight tomorrow. My name is Valesh Callistico, at your service." Then the door was shut before anyone could respond. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.